Hello, everyone. My name is Tiara Thomas, class of 2012, and I proudly serve as the president of the African American Alumni Association here at CWRU. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you this evening. The African American Alumni Association was officially established in October 2009, and our purpose is to provide support and networking opportunities to African American alumni of CWRU. We work to provide a forum for the university to recruit students, and we foster friendships amongst those connected with the university. So before we begin today's program, a few housekeeping notes. So you'll find that you're all muted by default. We ask that you please remain muted to limit background noise during the program. If you have any questions, please utilize the chat feature and we will do our best to get those questions answered for you. Also, so that we know who you are, we welcome you to rename yourself by clicking on participants, finding your name, and then using the more option and selecting rename. Finally, if possible, we ask that you turn your cameras on. We like to see your smiling faces. So with that, I am happy to welcome you to this installment of Profiles of Inclusive Excellence, a virtual series in collaboration with the African American Alumni Association, the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity, and the African and African American Studies program to highlight the work and research of our African American faculty. Our host for the evening will be Dr. Heather Burton. She is Associate Vice President and Senior Director for Faculty and Institutional Diversity with CWRU, where she specializes in gender and racial equity. And with that, I now turn the program over to Dr. Burton.
Thank you, Tiara. Thank you so much. It is really good to be with you all this evening, as always. And I was laughing, Tiara, and I'll give this again at the end. But we've had some name changes to occur for two of our co-sponsors. And so the African and African American Studies program has changed to Africana Studies, and the Office for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equal Opportunity has now changed to the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. So I've got an update. We just actually announced our new office name today. Today was the first public announcement of our new office name. So, and then Africana Studies, that actually changed also. So I got to give you those updates here. But as always, we are excited for Profiles of Inclusive Excellence. This is probably one of the fun parts of my job that I love, is to be able to use my journalism skills again, which my mom said it's about time you're using them again, but use my broadcasting skills again, but to also interview and just talk. And I don't want to say interview, but we talk. We have conversation and dialogue with great faculty on our campus and highlighting who they are, not only their work at Case Western Reserve, but just who they are as a person. And so tonight I'm excited because I have shared many spaces with my colleague, and I consider not only a colleague, but a friend and someone who has been an asset to the work that I do, as well as an asset to the university. So I welcome Dr. Noël Voltz to Inclusive Profiles of Excellence. And to kind of get us started, Noël, some of the things that we do is on Inclusive Profiles of Excellence. We have this tradition here where we start this series with the famous question. And I don't know if you remember the movie Brown Sugar, but it was the movie Brown Sugar with Sanaa Lathan and Taye Diggs. And in that movie, the repetitive question was, when did you fall in love with hip hop? So we do a kind of a twist with profiles. And we kind of start with, whatever opening words you may have, but then leading into, when did you fall in love? And this time we'll use history as that love. When did you fall in love with history? So Noël, that's what we'll do. We'll start right there.
Oh my goodness, I love this so much. What a good way to start out any conversation. When did I fall in love with history? I'll be honest, I probably fell in love with history as an undergrad, maybe about my sophomore year. I went to Ohio State for undergrad, and I started out as an opera major and was going to be a singer for a year. And I was like, this is great. except I realized I was only good at actually singing in the shower and at karaoke, but like music theory killed me. And so after a year of struggling through music theory classes, I reassessed my entire set of life choices and found myself just trying to figure out what I was interested in. And I took a couple classes in African American and African studies, and I wound up in an African American history class. And I remember having this moment of being like, things make sense. Oh, the Black experience. I'm not only learning about myself, it was the first time I had ever had Black faculty at the front of a room that I could see myself in. But then additionally, it was an incredibly charismatic professor, Hassan Jeffries. There was this other woman, Paulette Pierce, and both of them were just so inspiring to me as scholars that I was just transfixed, for lack of a better word. And I remember I was this like little like sophomore, and I went up to Dr. Hassan Jeffries, who's faculty at Ohio State, where still actually to this day. And he's phenomenal. If you ever get to meet him, see him talk, do so. It's amazing. He has phenomenal TED Talks out there. But I remember walking up to him and just being like, I want to do what you do. How do I become this, a professor? And he was like, well, if you want to do this, he was like, you need to do research. And so I was like, bet, okay, I've got this. No idea what I was actually doing, but I was like, sure, I can do this. And it started me down a journey that really, I by that point, by my sophomore year, I already knew I wanted to be a professor. And I think that faculty, Black faculty along the way saw that passion in me, and they nurtured it, and they mentored me. And very quickly, I was on a trajectory that led me all the way to grad school, and ultimately a few jobs later here to Case. And interestingly, the undergraduate research that I did as a sophomore in undergrad began as a sophomore in undergrad. It became my honors thesis in undergrad, my master's thesis, the topic of my dissertation, and is now my first monograph. So actually, I have been with this project since I was an undergrad. And it has, in that regard, I'm ready to like put it to bed. But also, it's something that really has driven or kind of pushed me to move forward. But yeah, I wanted to be a professor and a professor of history basically since I was a sophomore in undergrad. Before that, I was like, school, I'm not so sure, maybe singing, I don't know. But that was the moment.
I love it. I love it. And you know, I just found out something new. I knew that your PhD was from Ohio State, but I don't think I realized your undergrad and that everything was from Ohio State. I don't think I realized that. I'm an Ohio State grad. I did my undergrad at Ohio State. And my minor was IO. I tell people how great Ohio State is, Noel. I love Case. Case pays the bills, but I will always be a Buckeye. And I'm
fully a Buckeye. When I went out of undergrad, I applied to a lot of different grad programs. I was lucky enough and honored enough to get into some Ivies and other places. And I actually chose not to go to those because I had such amazing mentorship at Ohio State that I knew that these faculty mentors, Leslie Alexander, Walter Rucker, Hassan Jeffries, that Lucy Murphy, that they would make sure that I was getting the training that I needed to be an effective professor and a good professor. And so I stayed, and I have no regrets whatsoever. It was the best decision.
I love it. I love it. And it's interesting because Hassan Jeffries was here last year. So he was one of our Power of Diversity speakers. I think it was the year before, but he was actually at Case Western Reserve. And as you said, just a wealth of knowledge, great speaker. And really enjoyed having him on campus. And I listened to your story. I'm laughing at the whole music and the opera singing because I started at Ohio State. I always joke in biomedical engineering. And then I did a play. And I tell people it's something about, I want to talk about this for a moment. And I want you to think about this. It's something about the Black experience at Ohio State that is unique. And I remember freshman year, I was dead set on being a biomedical engineer. And even I had gone through Case's summer programs in high school for engineering. Got to Ohio State, I did a Black play. It was an all Black cast with a Black director, Black writer, and I lost my mind for Black people. And I called home and I was like, I'm changing my major from biomedical engineering to theater. And my family said, wait. So, but then I started taking Black studies classes. Mm-hmm. And I ended up graduating with a double major in journalism, Black studies, and minor in theater. But when you think about that, I know what my experience was, but when you think about that, how do you think that community, I try to tell people, we had the Black Cultural Center, we had the Black Studies Department, we had, Minority Affairs, Office of Diversity. I think it was Office of Diversity probably when you were there. It was Minority Affairs when I was, it was I'm aging myself, but it was Minority Affairs when I was there. But in that community, how do you think that shaped and developed who you are?
Absolutely. I mean, so I was actually raised in rural New Mexico. And so I had never really encountered Black academics, the academic world. Frankly, Black folks that had really even gone to college and continued on. And so Ohio State put me in the rooms with these brilliant minds that were telling me about me. And I think that that's really what changed me in so many ways. I think similar to you, I was in these music theory classes, and frankly, much of what's taught in a lot of music theory classes and music courses is this traditional canon of the classics, of Mozart and other European composers. And I not only, I could sing and I loved to sing, but I also felt disconnected in many ways from the material. And it didn't help that I had no idea what I was doing. But like the combination, I think, really made me try to realize that college is a time not only to learn things, but to discover yourself and to figure out who you are and who you are in the world, and also to figure out the world around you. I had spent a lot of summers throughout my childhood and high school years in like inner city urban Columbus, and my friends were all from this space, and as such, it was really, I wanted to understand the world that they were inhabiting. And it was when I first started learning about history, right, in these courses that it really drew me in. And it was because it was Black faculty breaking it down for me. They had a huge number of Black faculty when I was there. They had the Africana Studies Department. I think it's Africana now. It was African American and African Studies, AAAS, when I was going through. At the front desk, the minute you walked in the door, you had Miss Jeannie. I don't know if she was there when you were there, but she was the office kind of assistant, and she was phenomenal and this ray of light. She reached out to me actually recently on Instagram, and so it's still these connections that you made in that space. And I just felt so supported from the minute I arrived. I felt like I was put into places where there were people who looked like me, that then allowed me to see myself as possibly achieving success, if that makes sense, academic success. Ohio State it's special. I don't know how it is there now, but when I was going through between 2003 and there till 2014, it was a moment. And it sounds like it was a moment when you were there too, Heather, going to the Hannah Center. We had a Black community of Black history graduate students that all got together and worked together and learned together. And it was just a really enriching environment for me.
Yeah, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. And when I use Ohio State very often in talking about data when we talk about predominantly white institutions, because I'll often say, what do you think the percent of Black students is at Ohio State? And many people are like 30%, 25%. And I'm like, no, that's because you see the football team and the basketball team on TV. But Ohio State is 3% like most schools. But the thing about it is, because it is a large school, we'd have about 3,000 Blacks at any given time, which they did a great job with creating community for us and in really engaging us in community. And I think when you're telling your experience, how do you think that impacts your work with your students?
Oh my goodness, it is. My mentors, then the mentorship that I received as an undergrad and then later as a graduate student is literally what I model my teaching and mentorship on. I literally received mentorship where my faculty, these faculty of color, these Black faculty, gave so much of themselves to really just help me mature and not only as a scholar and as an intellectual and guide me through that process, but they truly cared about me as a person. And I like to this day, I can't speak enough to how much that has shaped how I approach my teaching. I care about my students not just as people in a class, students in a room, but also as whole people, who they are, what their hopes are, what they want for their lives. I just have felt so supported in my process from my mentors that I try to carry that forward. To give you an idea of like how supported we're talking here, I'm currently expecting, and the middle name for my son is going to be Alexander after Leslie Alexander, one of these mentors, because that is how important these people were in my life and really in shaping my sense of who I was and the person I want to become. I emulate these folks.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I've heard you speak to student groups and share your story and share the story about Leslie Alexander. But I've also seen you interact with students and hear students talk about you and speak about you very highly in terms of just what you've taught them. And I think it speaks volumes to what your experience has done and what your experience continues to do for students that you work with. And if we had more faculty to emulate Dr. Voltz, no, we might be a much better place. No, just don't record that one. But no, but just thank you for what you bring to the students. And I think it's a great experience. And then when you hear students speak about you, that speaks volumes. You mentioned your childhood briefly.
Yeah.
Tell us about what was it like growing up as Noël Voltz? What was that like?
Listen, so I was born in Columbus, Ohio, but I was adopted. I was the child of two very young teenage parents who had me. And so I was adopted out and actually adopted by a single mom who at the time was working at Ohio State. And she adopted me. And I think that really shaped me in that, like, when I chose to make my son, I actually did so as a single mom using a donor. But I was raised by a single mom who then married my dad when I was 6, and we Brady Bunched it, like me and her and all of him and his kids. His first wife had passed away from cancer, and they Brady Bunched it. And then they dumped us in rural New Mexico. Now, I should add to this story, this is very important, all these folks are white. So I was adopted into a completely white family, and then raised in rural New Mexico, which caused massive senses of who am I and identity crises, right? But also weirdly thrust me towards African-American history, because I think I found my Blackness through the past. I used the past and studying the past. I remember reading books as a child, like Having Our Say by the Delaney sisters, Coming of Age in Mississippi, these books that I used to really attach myself to the Black community in absence of a Black community. And then as soon as I could, my parents actually were fantastic enough to realize that I needed to be immersed. I mean, granted, I sometimes give them a side eye because you moved me to New Mexico, but like, it was cool. And actually the school I went to in New Mexico it's in this tiny town called Gallup, New Mexico, which is surrounded by the Navajo, Zuni, and Hopi reservations. And so the school I went to actually was 60% Native American, which is a completely different kind of experience, I think, that a lot of folks have. But I chose as kind of, once I was in elementary, middle school, high school, I started coming and spending summers in Columbus, and lived there actually on 13th, right on 13th Avenue, right by the fairgrounds, if you know that area.
Yes.
By 13th, I would stay there. I made friends. And so here's a really crazy story about this, actually. So I was there living, and it's because of that and those relationships that I made on 13th Ave and over across the street, across Cleveland, that I ended up deciding to go to Ohio State. And I just wanted to stay on and stay connected to those communities that I just built up a love for, right? And in many ways became my family. So about 7 years ago, I actually met my birth family, because I had originally had a closed adoption, and the adoption was opened. And so I was able to actually access those records, and I reached reached out to them. So I'm now deeply close to my birth family. My birth dad lives in Mansfield with my birth grandmother and their whole side of the family. My birth mom lives down in Columbus. But the crazy thing is while I was on 13th, it turns out my birth father, that entire neighborhood is where my birth family was from, and we did not know it at all. So I remember meeting people when I was just in the community hanging out and like, going to the corner store that turned out to be my cousins and my uncles and aunts that I had no idea I was actually related to. And so I went to the first family barbecue and I was like, I know you. And it was totally these people who I'd met on 13th. And then it gets even more weird. The first house I stayed at, the first summer I went, turns out to be the actual house my father was born in. My birth father was born in. Completely disconnected in time, no idea, no connect points. But I really feel like those were moments that were leading me home, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
So now it's a family that I'm deeply integrated with. And it's been an amazing kind of journey of learning about who they are, helping them learn about who I am. And I feel as much a part of their family, if not more so in some ways, than I even do my adoptive family. It's kind of just, I feel like family is always additive. You can have chosen family and adopted family and kin, and there's just so many ways that family can be defined. So yeah, but
and would you say, I'm sorry,
it was a weird existence growing up in rural New Mexico.
Yeah, and I was, I think you've said so much in that I don't want to do the journalism prying, but
pry away.
there's just so much in there. Is how do you think those two dynamics, one being adopted and then two finding your birth parents, how do you think that has had an impact on who you are and your identity?
Absolutely. I think it's had a number of impacts. I think first, it has broadened my understanding of what defines Blackness, to be honest. I think sometimes we can have a very narrow definition of who is Black and what it means to be Black, but I challenged my students this last semester to really think broadly about that. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to have a Black experience and what does it not? And is somebody not Black if they don't have a traditional stereotypical experience? And so it's forced me to make sure that I think about Blackness in its full complexity and in its full range. And then it's also, I think, helped me really think about the identity navigating that my students are doing actively. I was doing it during college, is really trying to not find myself actively. And I see in my students, even if they come from very different backgrounds than I do, they're trying to figure out who they are in the world. And I think a lot of my academic journey was me trying to figure myself out and figure out who I was. I think there's sort of this stodgy academic relationship to our subject where we're disconnected and we are these fully objective and, separated people, at least in history, that are just looking to the past to understand the past for its past own sake. And what I realized is that the past is very much relevant to the present. Mm-hmm. And these two things have a circular relationship. They shape one another. And so I think that really shaped how I view both my students, but also my work, right? I think that the work that I do focuses at people who are living at intersections that we don't always think about. And those intersections can be complicated and complex and messy. And I think that that's really impacted how I view my subject matter, making sure that I complicate what sometimes can feel like a simple story. When we talk about Black women, right, if we talk about Black women's history, it encompasses a lot of different women from a lot of different life experiences. And so we need to make sure we're paying attention to that nuance. And so I think that was kind of really informing for me. And now since kind of meeting my birth family, I think one of the things that's been really cool is connecting to the family. Like the other night, or this is a couple of weeks ago, my partner, he and I ended up doing a deep dive into my genealogical history. And tracing Black genealogy is actually incredibly challenging, right? As we know, our records become very scant, but we traced it. And I finally was able to trace our family back to this small town in Mississippi, where at least the last generation that was enslaved. And I think that that's something that I hadn't been able to do before, right? Before, when I was adopted but didn't know my birth family, I could connect through other people's stories. And I knew I had a story, but I couldn't tell you my story, specifically my people's story. And it was so cool to have this moment now where I was able to actually do the genealogy and go back and be like, wow, this is when the Great Migration happened for my family, right? This is when this family went to Virginia and then they came to Cleveland. This is where they started. This is where they were enslaved. These were their owners, right? And I think that it brought a sense of real tangible attachment to the past that being adopted, I had through scholarship, but this sort of emotional blood kin piece, I knew was there, but couldn't articulate it because I didn't know who they were. And so that's been really fun to be able to connect in that way and find literally not just my people, my folk, like Black folk, but specifically
your folk.
My people.
Yeah, I love it. And I love just, and you can, and I don't know if you all can see it, but you can just see the excitement and the joy that you have by just sharing this and what it has done for you to be able to find your birth parents and to connect the genealogy. And so I'm excited. I don't even know your birth parents, but I'm excited that it was an opportunity for you all to reconnect and how the relationship is growing and developing. So that's such a blessing for you. And I want to mention that for those of you who are on the call, we do take questions from the chat. So if you have any questions for Dr. Voltz, please put those in the chat. Now, I do screen the questions, so if they're inappropriate, I will not ask those questions. But if you have questions, please put those in the chat. And as we kind of shift a little bit, I want to talk about your research and your work. And how did this come about? Was this all based on your identity when we start talking about women of color and slavery and freedom? Did this have anything to do with who you are and that connection? And then just tell us more and what it looks, because you don't hear very often that someone's research started from undergrad and continued until now with writing. And so that whole path that you have from undergrad to a book, tell us about it.
Yeah, so my research, it was focused. I knew when I was in undergrad that so I'm mixed. I'm half Black, half white. I identify as a Black woman. I look like a Black woman, but I'm technically half Black and half white. And I knew I wanted to do research that was investigating how other folks of mixed race ancestry were identifying, right? How did one navigate the world as a mixed race person when I very clearly understood myself as Black and yet have this mixed identity? And so I was in search, right, as an undergrad to try to figure out that part of who I was, right? And it led me randomly to this social institution in New Orleans that are called the Quadroon Balls. So Quadroon Balls, and I'll let you know, quadroon is a word that means 1/4 Black, 3/4 white. And the Quadroon Ball was a social institution of the antebellum era in New Orleans, where they were dances that were limited to Black women and white men. And the purpose of them was to basically put them in social circles with one another to create sexual relationships, sexual ties. Some would say concubinage, some would say marriage, some would say sexual, like kind of violation relationships, kind of a sexual sales moment, auction block, for lack of a better word. But I stumbled across this topic and I became fascinated. So I was on this search to I wanted to understand mixed race women, to do a little bit more digging. And then New Orleans just became a space to look in. And then Quadroon Balls, as soon as I heard about these dances, I was hooked. I was like, wait, time out, what's happening? Because really for me, history, in many ways, history is yesterday's gossip. As somebody who is actually an avid, reality TV watcher, there is a way in which history is oddly similar to that, in that, and before I get fired for saying this, in that I think that all documents are scripted in some way, right? All documents, all primary sources that we engage with, primary sources being documents that were created in the past, right? All of them have a perspective, have a bias, are showing us only one thing. Just like a reality television show, right? We think it's reality, but it's not actually reality. And yet through the process of looking at all of these characters, whether it's, you know, in the Real Housewives or whether it's in the past, you can get a sense for the choices that people make. And oftentimes choices that are shaped by their lives and their economic standing and their gender and their sexuality. And so I just became really fascinated by these quadroon balls because I was like, time out. So there are these dances that have first white men and free women of color. Time out, that's new. So free women of color were Black women in the antebellum era that actually were not enslaved. And in fact, not only were not enslaved, some of them enslaved other Black folks. And it wasn't just family members. They did so for economic purposes. So that just blew my mind because I was like, wait, so what kind of complexity is happening here that allows one to sort of remove themselves in terms of their identity from this wider Black community? Like, what is playing out here? There's sex, there's intrigue, and I was hooked. I was like, this is the topic. I want to study these mixed race women, these free women of color, and what they're doing, who they're doing, and where they're doing it. That was sort of where I wanted to go. So I started this journey, and I'll be honest as well. And this is me becoming very real. And I've talked about this in some of the various public talks I've given, that honestly at the time, you know, I myself am a victim of sexual assault and sexual violence. And I think I was also looking for a topic that allowed me to study women regaining control over their bodies. Right? Sexual control over their bodies. I wanted to find women who, in the face of horrible tragedy or horrible circumstances, slavery, for example, or in my context, you know, they took control over their bodies and they used their bodies as their own weapons. And so actually the title of the book, so currently is, until the editors change it, which they probably will, is The Sword in Her Hands. And it's because I wanted to talk about the body as one of the things that Black women had control over when they did not have control over a lot. And not all Black women, right? Enslaved women did not have this control, but free women of color in some ways did. And so I was hooked. Now, of course, because of that personal element, interestingly, I think my argument in many ways was a reflection of where I was at in my therapy sessions, in that I was like, these women have full control over their bodies and they can be agents. And because they're free, that means that they can do it. That was my undergrad argument. And then I very quickly realized that that's not the reality, right? One can be both an agent and a victim at the same time. And it's actually important that one holds both of those things together. And so that's what then, as I started, you know, expanding and developing the project as in a master's program and then a PhD, and now for this book, is really trying to suss out that nuance, the choices that people make. And sometimes they're choices that we don't always agree with, frankly, like slave ownership. What puts a Black person in a position where that is the choice they are making? But also let's acknowledge that that's the choice that they're making. Right. And so I just became really fascinated. And so now the project is really about the ways in which Black women use their bodies, sexual relationships, intimate ties to navigate society. And so, yeah, The Sword in Her Hands actually comes from a court case in the 1850s in Louisiana, where there's this Black woman and she's partnered with, so marriage is illegal in 19th century Louisiana, interracial marriage. So she's a concubine is what the law called her, of this white man. And he's actually like a total crook and filing constantly for bankruptcy fraud. So he regularly takes out a bunch of debt and then says, I don't have anything, and then files for bankruptcy. And so what he would do is take out all of this property, put it in the name of this Black woman, and then he would file for bankruptcy so he didn't have to pay the bills. And so eventually all these creditors catch up to him, and he's immediately like, well, I'm gonna need my money. And he goes back to the Black woman and sues the Black woman. And the court, interestingly, comes back. And they don't, and I was assuming when I read these cases, oh, the Black woman's going to lose. You're talking about a Black woman in like 1850s Louisiana versus a white dude. Like, this is not an even playing field. And yet the court came back, the Second District Court came back in New Orleans, and they said, if you put a shield in the hands of your concubine to shield yourself from the attack of your creditors, and she turned that shield into a sword and now has topped or lopped you off of your substance, it is your own fault. We don't care. And they dismissed the case, and the Black woman ends up getting to keep all of that property. And so those were the stories that fascinated me. I was like, wait a minute, she is using what she has in this relationship and choosing to partner with this man which is an incredibly risky relationship because it's tenuous. She's not legally married. She has no legal rights, yet is able to really use that to her advantage. And the courts actually back her up. She keeps the property. She moves on. She will pass it on to her children.
I love it. And I can't wait to read. And I hope everyone else on the call is feeling the same way I am, that I cannot wait to read this. And especially, as you said, to see a Black woman win in 1851, to actually see
like they are winning left, right, and side. I can tell some stories. Those stories are fun. Yeah, this is what drew me in then, right? So then it was the stories, but it was the stories about complexity, right? That's what it is. My favorite character I've ever come across, her name was Cora Lalonde. Again, she ends up coming before the Louisiana Supreme Court in 1860. And this is what she does. So she's actually light-skinned enough to pass for white. And so she actually passes for white and legally marries a white man in New Orleans. And then like right after they get married, he finds out that she's Black somehow through the rumor mill. And like, this is fighting words. He puts it out in the New Orleans Bee, the newspaper. And he's like, she's Black. I didn't know she's Black. How dare she be Black? I don't want it. She has no right to bear my name. And he breaks up with her, right? Those are fighting words. It's over. So he separates from her. So a little bit later, she ends up in another sexual relationship with a different white man who ends up dying and leaving her money. And when she dies, all of a sudden, this white guy pops back up to the stage. He's like, well, I'm her husband, so I have rights to her property, so give me the money. And she goes to court, and I thought she was going to have to like put forth all of this effort to say, like, I worked hard for this money. It's mine. You know, I labored and prove all of her kind of industriousness. And instead, she literally goes to court and she's like, I'm Black. He's white. He had no right to marry. We had no legal right to get married anyways. So actually, I get to keep my money. The court agrees with her. She wins. And then 10 years later, I find her in the census. She's passing for white again. And then also still using dude's name, despite the fact that he has like moved on and married a white woman and has a whole white family. But that was the ingenuity, this sort of passing for white, passing for Black, identity manipulation that just like, it just excited me. And so that's the project. I hope people do enjoy reading it once it's done.
I think so. I can't imagine that we will not enjoy reading it. I'm looking forward to the completed project. I do want to take this question from the chat. Someone is curious if you watched Bridgerton, and I will back up. I'm going to give you, before I go to that question, I have to give you, what do you got? And I'll be a co-conspirator with you, Noël. I use co-conspirator very often, but in the reality TV junkie world, and I know most people would be very disappointed in us as
I'm a failure. It's fine. I just embraced it at this point.
Yeah, so do I, Noël. And you know, I tell people though that one of the reasons I also ratchet is just because of what you said, is understanding that it's not reality and that it's scripted. And me, with having my whole theater background and acting background, I'm usually watching to see mic packs and stuff. Like I was watching Real Housewives of Atlanta Sunday, looking at all of these mic packs. And I'm like, people, we know you're scripted, you got mic packs on. Or when folks that wake up with a full face of makeup at 6 a.m., like, teach me that trick. I need to know. So, but let me take this trick. Now, I don't know this question. Have you watched Bridgerton?
So I have. I watched the first 2 seasons. I haven't done the Queen Charlotte yet. Queen Charlotte, Queen.
Yeah, Queen Charlotte is
Queen Charlotte. Yeah, I haven't done that. That's actually on my plate for this weekend. I have to get through a boatload of grading first. But once that grading is off my plate, my payment is going to be Queen Charlotte. And yeah, Bridgerton, it's entertaining.
Yes, Bridgerton is entertaining, and I've started Queen Charlotte, so I'm on episode 3. But the question is, and if you can answer this, it's do you have any thoughts about how history is used in this series as a way of talking about and reframing, or even with rewriting history? So do you have any thoughts around that?
Good question. That's a really good question. I think the first thing to remember about Bridgerton is that it's fundamentally fiction. It is based on a fictional series. It actually isn't, it's historical romance in that like it is literally outside of like being set in the Regency period in a space and place. All the rest of it is sort of created, right? And it's created whether it's about Black people or about white people, which is what the original like author actually intended, right? It's all fabricated. It's all sort of a fiction of the imagination of the author. And so I think as such, we have to be really careful when we start to dabble with fiction and apply it to the past, because I think oftentimes the issue with fiction is it can simplify, again, a lot of those nuances. Things like class in Bridgerton are really not that apparent. I mean, it's there, but the level of poverty that many people are living in during the same Regency period isn't fully acknowledged, right? That for every high and for every person that had a landed gentry person, for all the bourgeoisie, right? There is a bunch of people who are working land and who are kind of exploited in the process. Those buildings didn't just build themselves, right? And I think that that's something that those fictional shows sort of brush over, right? Because it's not romantic. It's not it's not sexy to pay attention to that. It's more like sexy to pay attention to hot dude and a woman making out, right? Like that's the sexy part. I think I love sort of what they're doing in terms of Bridgerton by playing with race and putting Black characters into places that we don't usually picture Black characters. So for example, last night I actually started watching, or actually I finished, what am I talking about? I binged it. But the new Anne Boleyn, which is a show actually starring a Black woman as Anne Boleyn, and like just placing her in this historical context. It reminded me of Bridgerton, except an actual historical like story. But what happens when we change the face of the Regency era? And I think that it's important that we start to do that. It does a really good job of sort of flipping our understanding and adding some complexity to our understanding of who had power and who didn't. It's important to remember, for example, that not all Black people who are in Europe are entering Europe as enslaved peoples, right? Many of them are actually, there are diplomats, there are businessmen coming from the continent, they are traveling throughout Europe. And so there is a very real possibility that there are Black folks at court that are, and you know, these kind of elite spaces that are there, and we never are taught that, right? Because that slave-free dichotomy becomes Black and white, and becomes sort of very disconnected and solidified. And I think that there was a lot more movement than we like to think about. And I think that the characters that, in my own research, the people that I study are operating in that liminal space, right? In these in-between spaces, class-wise, racially. And so I think Bridgerton is important because it's putting Black folks into spaces that normally they're not depicted in. It's showing Black people with wealth, but it's also, we should not take it too seriously because again, it's fiction. And I think we need to be careful not to hold fiction authors to this sort of historical, accuracy pings that we would do for say, a historian.
Yeah, I love it. And I know that I remember listening to Shonda Rhimes on an interview and saying that she purposely does not cast based on race. She casts based on who's just the best person that's auditioning for the role. I don't know if she did the same thing with Bridgerton, but I know that was her philosophy for like Grey's Anatomy and all of the other shows that she's done. So Tira in the chat said that she may have missed it, but when will the project be completed?
So that is a great question that I'm always trying to answer for myself. Basically, the project is under contract with University of Illinois Press. And my hope is that it's going to come out probably not next year because baby, but probably the year after that. So 2025 is sort of my goal for it to come out. I'm ready to move on to my next project, which is about a Black woman who's accused of being a serial killer. I'm ready for it. This project needs to go to bed so that I can take off on the next one.
You have some interesting projects.
Listen, I refuse to do boring history. I won't call
Yes.
it. Some people really like studying the history of spoons and I don't know, 15th century Europe. It's cool. I'm not that person. I really do sort of see the past as something I can get into and get messy with and find messy stories. I think that's actually, I like messy actually. I think messy is kind of fun.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, I like that you have messy in, and that's why I think for your research, it relates to gossip and TV because it's great information to make us draw us in. VP Solomon let us know that one of his favorite books is Having Our Say, which is still on his shelf. And then that Shonda Rhimes says that Queen Charlotte is based upon a real person of African descent who is in the royal family line. So just that kind of tidbit of information. But for those of you on the call, you've heard Dr. Voltz say that she's expecting. And let me say this, is I teased Dr. Voltz and her partner because her partner was a North Star hire that I had an opportunity to meet and interview. I'm not gonna say interview, but meet, because I tell people I don't interview, but meet and have a great conversation. I was so excited that Dr. John Bickers was coming to Case Western Reserve University. And I met at dinner with Noël, and Noël tells me that she's expecting, and then she tells me that she's engaged. And she just throws out John's name. So I tell Noël and John, they are like the poster people for Case Western Reserve. This is what can happen to you in a year. Dr. Bickers and Noël got a grant from the Mellon Foundation. They got married and they're expecting a baby. Look at that in 1 year. So folks, if you want good opportunity, come to Case Western Reserve. That's my new tagline using. So congratulations on everything when it comes to, you know, the marriage, the baby, and your son who is 3, right?
He's 3, almost 4. Yeah.
Tyro's going on 4. So we congratulations on all of that. I do. I was thinking about some of the things that, you know, you've been saying, and I think that we someone just put another question in the chat, and I want to give an opportunity for that, and then I'll kind of come back. But just or I'll come to my question first. What was it that made you choose Case Western Reserve?
Yeah.
Why here?
That's a good question. So as I said, I was raised in Ohio. I have built up this massive community because I was here for all of undergrad, or for most of like high school, all of my breaks, college, then master's, PhD. So Ohio had great ties to me. And I, at the time when the Case job kind of came on the scene, I was faculty at the University of Utah. I was faculty there for 4 years. I was super single because dating in Utah was a challenge. And by that point, I had not only, I was super single, expecting to be probably single for the rest of my life, which is why John just came out of nowhere. But I actually decided to have a child on my own. And so I went to reproductive endocrinologist and I did the whole medical thing and I made my son, and I was a single mom to my amazing Black son. And I think the combination of like realizing that I was also going to be raising a Black son in Utah and being deeply uncomfortable with that. Like, I was like, I think I can subject myself to Utah, but I don't necessarily feel comfortable raising my son here. And then suddenly this job opens up. And I had always said from jump, like from the minute I became a faculty member, if a job came open at Ohio State or Case Western, because those are both schools that I think value research and teaching, and so would really allow me to do both of those things. If a job came open, I'm applying. And so the job came open and I applied. And at that point, it was me going to University of Utah and being like, yeah, like the writing's on the wall. When I got the job offer, I was like, I'm going. It meant that I get to raise my son, not only in Cleveland, which is a majority Black city, but then also around that family, because around this exact same time, I actually had met my birth family. And so I wanted the chance to live close to them, because it's hard to really build those relationships when you're in Utah, right? And so it was this chance to actually be, an hour drive to Mansfield. So like on Saturday, I'm going to pack up my son and go spend the day with his great grandma, celebrating Mother's Day, right? And so I think that was really what drew me to Case. Case is an excellent institution. But again, about being a whole person, I thought about my career and was like, this is a good space for me, not only as an academic, but also as a whole person. And it really drew me here.
Yeah, and to have your mind kind of made up and saying those two institutions, and then to be able to come to an institution that you actually wanted to come to before you even applied, was a great opportunity. There's a question I'm going to take from the chat. Our last question is, with your experience with your adopted family and your birth family, and in your research, do you feel like you are living in two worlds?
So yes and no. Yes, so I'll speak personally in terms of adoption and birth family. For the longest, yes, I actually really kept those two worlds very separate by choice. Some of it is like, toxic. My adoptive family wasn't necessarily always the healthiest space to be in. Some people were, but many people were not. And so as such, right, I kind of was keeping my adoptive family over here and my birth family over here and leaving them separate. It was actually, for the first time, was at my wedding, like a month ago. I got married a month ago, y'all. I planned it in 10 days. It worked great. It was exactly what I wanted. But it was the first time I had kind of the mixing of the two and really trying to integrate these two parts of my life. My birth family was there. My adoptive family was there. And I kind of just threw up my hands. I think I was trying to control it all and make sure that, it stayed in its compartments. And I realized that that's actually not possible, right? That I'm a whole person and I wanted to be integrated in that regard and have my two families represented. And I figured they could just deal with their issues themselves. And then I think tied to that with research, again, I think going back to that point about this sort of sense that to do academic work, you have to be at this complete distance or disconnect from your subject matter. And I think what I have intentionally done as I've been recrafting the manuscript is thinking about the ways in which, why do we do that? Why do we somehow assume, that the writer isn't also there as a part of their interpretive, their interpretation of the past? Like nobody ever questions white scholars who study Europe about their identity and how their identity shapes their study of white kings and white queens and white folks, but they ask Black folks. And I think rather than run from that question and be like, no, I am completely, disconnected, I actually have chosen to just embrace it. And I'm currently toying with my research about a way to integrate my personal narrative, not necessarily into the book itself, but as an addendum, like this is the journey that I took. And this is how my personal story is impacting my scholarly interpretations. And instead of hiding that, embracing that. And so trying again to push for integration of the whole person, of really putting myself in my past as a part of our interpretation, because every book, everything you read has an interpretation. It has a bias, it has a slant, it has a perspective, and it's whether the author wants to acknowledge that or not. And so I would much rather acknowledge that. And so I try to kind of live the kind of authenticity in my personal life that I hope will also reflect in my scholarship as well, and write a damn good book, but also really an authentic book.
Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question for the person that had in the chat. And to kind of wrap us up, and I don't know if you have anything else that you may want to add that I didn't ask you, but want to leave the audience with this question. What is it that Dr. Voltz likes to do?
Cool. Okay, that is a good question. So, of course, personal life and family life take up a large chunk of my free time now. I now have learned about children's museums, children's play places, parks all around Cleveland. But actually, one of the things that I think surprises a lot of people is what's right here. One of my newfound hobbies is actually Legos. I love collecting Legos. I do these giant sets. This is one of the many that I have put together. It became a hobby about 2 years ago that I have always had this fascination or joy. Okay, so most people find this insane. Putting together IKEA furniture. I know most people are like, this is the world's worst thing ever. I would randomly put on a podcast and then just jam out and put together IKEA furniture, and it would bring me happiness and joy, which is very weird. I understand that. But I was like, how can I get the IKEA effect without actually buying a million bookcases? Because that's not logical, or nor do I have the space for that. And so I had this moment where a friend of mine had a Lego set, and I was like, that's cool. And so I was realizing Lego is essentially IKEA furniture on a small scale that I can like take apart and put together and build and create with. And so I have become a Lego head. And so I have many giant Lego sets that are slowly taking over my house and my life, and hopefully will eventually be passed on to my sons. But that is something I do to decompress, is throw on a podcast. And oftentimes the podcasts I listen to are either true crimes or recaps and analysis of reality television shows that I've watched. I'll throw those on and I just go to town and I will zen out and just build. And it's a nice creative outlet and a nice self-care outlet for me.
Yeah, I love it. And I haven't played with Legos in a long time, but that used to be my go-to as a child is Legos. So I understand the building. Yeah.
I never realized they were for adults, but they've actually released a whole series now for adults. And so I love them. I highly recommend them. Embrace the inner child.
Yes, always. And it's what makes us happy. That's where we find joy, if we go back to the inner child. And I don't know, Dr. Voltz, we're at our time, but if I have not asked you something that you just want to share with us, I want to give you a moment to share.
Thank you. First, this has been an honor and a joy to be here and to be in fellowship and conversation with you. It's so cool to see how many people have tuned into this. And at any point, if I'm on campus, if you're in the area, reach out, say hi. If you ever want to sit in on a class, you are more than welcome. My hope is to just really bring the case to the community to case. And so, yeah, my door is always open, whether you're technically enrolled in my classes or not.
And I love, and Dr. Voltz is being honest, she's open to everyone, and especially just sharing information, a kind heart who does not mind giving and helping others. And so we thank you. We thank you for actually closing out our academic year. This is our last profiles for the 2022-2023 academic year. So we thank you that you were able to do our May series, the month of May. And what a great way to close out the year. What a great conversation. Again, thank you for all that you do for Case Western Reserve University. And I thank you all for being with us this year, and look for us next year. We will be back with more of our Black faculty on campus that we will have these same type of conversations with. And so I'm going to turn things over to Tiara to close us out for the evening.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. Thank you, Dr. Voltz. Thank you for an amazing time. This was just this was great. I thank you for being open and being genuine and really sharing your story and sharing your work. I wish you were there when I was there, because I surely would have been in your class. So
come back, come visit, take classes, come sit in.
Pop up. But yes, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. As Dr. Burton said, thank you for joining us for our last profile of inclusive excellence for the year. We look forward to seeing you all in the fall. And in the meantime, if you want to learn more about the African American Alumni Association, feel free to visit our website. If you search case.edu/alumni, or you can follow us on Facebook if you search Case Western Reserve University African American Alumni Association, or you can search us at CWRU AAAA Alumni. So thank you again. for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Yes, and I do want to thank our co-sponsors for the event as well, for these profiles. So VP Solomon was on the call. So thank you to the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. Thank you to Africana Studies. And then thank you to the African American Alumni Association, better known as Quad A, for entrusting that we could get this done, and that we have been doing this now. This is completing our third year. So we will be going into, we'll be going into, is it our third year or second year?
I think it's our third year.
It's our third year.
Or our fourth year.
Yeah, we'll be going into our fourth year. So thanks to everyone who have participated and made this a success.